After years of conflict, King Agamemnon of Mycenae unifies the Greek kingdoms of ancient Greece, bringing them into a loose alliance under his leadership. Agamemnon leads his army closer to Thessaly in an effort to conquer it and add it to his list of ongoing conquests. Priapus, the king of Thessaly, strikes a deal with Agamemnon to avoid open combat by letting each side's strongest fighter decide the outcome of the conflict. Priapus summons the giant Boagrius, and Agamemnon summons Achilles, a warrior who is half god and endowed with superhuman strength and agility, but the fabled hero is nowhere to be found. Agamemnon curses the stubbornness of the fiercest warrior Greece has ever seen as a messenger boy is dispatched to get him. Achilles chooses to follow his own path and become famous in history rather than join forces with Agamemnon. He arrives at the battlefield in his armor and skillfully defeats Boagrius with ease, thereby securing Agamemnon's rule over Thessaly.
Imagine a king who fights his own battles. Wouldn't that be a sight?
I hate him the most.
King Priapus, who is obviously pleased by the skills of Achilles, offers him the scepter of Thessaly to present to his own king, Agamemnon. But Achilles exclaims that he has no king and walks away. As distinguished guests, Prince Hector of Troy and his younger brother Paris dine in King Menelaus of Sparta's dining hall as they discuss a peace settlement. Paris, however, sneaks away to be with Menelaus' stunning wife, Queen Helen, as it transpires that they are having an affair. After making love, Paris persuades Helen to return with him to Troy. Hector, who is suspicious of his younger brother's relationship with Helen, threatens Paris by stating that if Paris ever puts Troy in danger, he will take his pretty face off of his pretty skull. As they are sailing back to Troy, Paris, despite Hector's warnings, unveils Helen, whom he had sneaked on board. Hector is obviously upset by his little brother's actions, but it is too late for him to take Helen back to Sparta and ask for forgiveness. When Menelaus learns of this, he meets with his older brother Agamemnon and requests his assistance in taking revenge by capturing Troy, the allegedly impregnable city. Agamemnon gladly accepts his brother's proposal because he will be able to rule the Aegean Sea after he vanquishes Troy. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, is instructed by Agamemnon to convince Achilles to assist them in capturing Troy. He discovers Achilles battling with his inexperienced young cousin, Patroclus. Despite Odysseus' assurance that this war and its heroes will never be forgotten, Achilles first refuses to go. However, after a visit to his mother, Thetis, a sea nymph, who assures him that even though he will die in the war, he will be glorified forever, he ultimately agrees to go. Hector, Paris, and Helen are all cordially welcomed back to Troy by their fellow Trojans and King Priam, the father of Hector and Paris. Paris introduces Helen to his father, who accepts her and compliments her on her beauty. Hector's young son and wife, Andromache, are also reunited with him. In a conversation with his father, Hector believes that they won't be able to the war, but King Priam assures him that they can, with the help of the gods. The Trojans prepare for the battle ahead of them outside the walls of Troy. Troy is believed to be impenetrable due to the thick and tall wall protecting the city. Agamemnon and his vast army are approaching the shores of Troy, escorted by Achilles, who also brought his own men, the ferocious and fearsome Myrmidons, and his cousin Patroclus. Worried for the security of Patroclus, Achilles orders him to remain in the ship and keep an eye on it, despite the eagerness of Patroclus to take part in the fight. Before the campaign, Achilles rallies his troops with enthusiasm. Hector also does the same, and they both proceed to the shores of Troy with their armies.
Break up your positions!
Since the Myrmidons are faster rowers than Agamemnon's army, they're the first to reach the shores of Troy. Achilles and his Myrmidons play a significant role in the ultimate Greek invasion of the Trojan shore. Achilles single-handedly defeats the Trojan warriors on his way to the temple of Apollo and orders the destruction of the temple. Disregarding the Myrmidons' leader Eutorus' caution not to anger the gods, Achilles decapitates the statue of Apollo in a rebellious act. In order to repel Agamemnon's army, Prince Hector launches an assault. As he approaches the temple of Apollo, Achilles and his Myrmidons sabotage and kill most of Hector's men. Achilles is confronted by Hector, but he declines to engage in combat. After explaining that it would be preferable for their fight to take place in front of an audience, Achilles permits Hector to go. As a result, the Greeks successfully captured the shores of Troy. Achilles arrives in his hut to see Briseis, a priestess of the temple of Apollo and the cousin of Paris and Hector, tied up as his prize. She chastises Achilles for destroying the temple just before he is called to see Agamemnon, who is getting ready to celebrate the victory. He becomes enraged when Agamemnon dubiously snatches Briseis from him and declares that, before his time is done, he'll look down on the corpse of Agamemnon and smile. The following evening, King Priam, his sons, and his advisors gathered to discuss whether they could win the war against the Greeks. Paris, feeling guilty that he's the cause of the war, announces to personally challenge Menelaus in a one-on-one fight the next morning, in exchange for Helen and the city's safety. Prior to the encounter, Priam exhorts Paris to fight for love and presents him with the Sword of Troy, which is said to contain the history of their nation, to help him win. Hector spots a hooded figure in the hallways and pursues it, only to discover that it's Helen trying to flee the city. She feels guilty for being the only reason so many Trojan warriors perished that day, but Hector explains that she is now a princess of Troy and that going back to Menelaus will not put an end to the conflict. The next day, with a few Trojan soldiers waiting nearby and King Priam and Helen watching from the top of the wall, Hector and Paris ride out to meet Menelaus and Agamemnon outside the walls of Troy. Achilles, still furious at losing Briseis, observes from a nearby hill with his troops as Menelaus, Agamemnon, Agamemnon confronts Hector and Paris and asks that they return Helen to Menelaus and submit to his rule. Hector boldly rejects, and Paris offers to face Menelaus one-on-one in the hopes that this will put an end to the conflict. Agamemnon could care less if Paris returned Helen to his brother, but he gives Menelaus the chance to exact his vengeance. The two begin their duel, and Menelaus, who is obviously the stronger of the two, injures Paris and nearly kills him before being murdered by Hector.
You coward!
Agamemnon, furious, leads his army forward as Hector hurriedly sends his injured brother back and gathers his army. Achilles, who is still observing from the mountaintop, mutters an insult at Agamemnon's inability to keep his troops in line. In the ensuing battle, Hector manages to kill many Greek soldiers with his strategies, including Ajax, one of the fiercest Greek warriors, demonstrating that he is the stronger warrior. Many other Greek soldiers died, causing Agamemnon and his army to retreat and flee to the Trojan shore.
Back to the ships! Back to the ships!
Menelaus' death renders the main justification for the attack on Troy irrelevant, and Agamemnon finds it difficult to come up with ideas for rallying his brother's army to his cause. Odysseus advises Agamemnon to ignore his doubts and enlist Achilles to battle once more. Agamemnon agrees and gives Briseis to the Greek warriors so they might entertain themselves with her. But Achilles saves her and brings her back to his hut, where he shows her a more reflective side of himself. Later that night, Briseis intends to kill Achilles by holding a knife to his throat while he sleeps, but instead she falls in love with him, and they make love. The following morning, Odysseus visits Achilles once again in an effort to persuade him to fight for Agamemnon once more, but he turns down his proposal. Then, much to Patroclus' dismay, Achilles decides that he has had enough of war and wants to depart Troy with Briseis, having wanted to fight and avenge the deaths of his fellow Greek warriors. After consulting his advisors, Priam commands Hector to reclaim the Trojan shore and drive the Greeks home before dawn, despite Hector's misgivings. The Trojan army, led by Hector, attacks the Greeks on the shore as daylight draws near. The invasion does, however, bring the Greeks together, and the Myrmidons, led by a warrior believed to be Achilles, join the battle. In their fight, Hector easily defeats the man believed to be Achilles in a duel and slashes his throat. However, he learns that Patroclus was the one who had impersonated Achilles. With the aid of his sword, Hector aids Patroclus in dying a decent death, and both armies, worn out from the combat, decide to call it a day. Achilles receives news of the passing of his cousin when the Myrmidons return to camp. Furious, Achilles strikes Eutorus and swears vengeance on Hector. Hector reveals a hidden passage under Troy to his wife Andromache out of fear for Achilles. He gives her instructions to take their child and any survivors out of the city to the mountains in case he passes away and the city is destroyed. The next day, as Achilles prepares to leave and take revenge on Hector, Briseis pleads with him to reconsider, but he ignores her and rides off in his chariot. Achilles shows up outside of Troy enraged, and Hector is challenged to a duel by him. Hector says goodbye to his family since he believes this fight may be his last, and meets Achilles outside the walls of Troy by himself.
No!
Hector! Hector!
Hector suggests before the fight that the winner should grant the loser all due funeral rites, but Achilles rejects it, and the fight begins. Priam and Paris watch the fight in despair, while Helen consoles Andromache, who is unable to force herself to look. After a fierce battle between the two, Hector is fatally killed, and Achilles drags his body behind his chariot on his way back to the Trojan beach, while the other Trojans watch in horror. When Achilles arrives and enters his hut, Briseis starts to weep for the death of her cousin, Hector. King Priam sneaks into the camp that evening and begs Achilles to give him Hector's body so that a suitable funeral will be held. Feeling repentant for his deeds, Achilles accepts and pledges that the Greeks won't assault Troy for 12 days so that Hector's funeral rituals can be performed without interruption, and permits Briseis to return to Troy with Priam. When Agamemnon learns of Achilles' covert agreement with Priam, he becomes infuriated and vows to conquer Troy at all costs. After being moved by a horse sculpture a fellow soldier is creating for his son, Odysseus comes up with a plan to allow the Greeks to invade Troy by taking advantage of the 12-day mourning period. He has the Greeks construct a massive wooden horse as a peace offering and conceal their ships in a nearby cove. After the 12 days of mourning, the Trojans discover the wooden horse on the beach and various bodies lying in the sand, believing the Greeks have abandoned the shores. Suspicious, Paris urges his father to burn the horse right away. But after being advised that it was left as a gift to the sea god Poseidon, Priam overrides Paris' request and brings the horse into the city, where it is revered as a sign of the end of the war, and the entire city celebrates into the night. In the middle of the night, Greeks who had been hiding within the horse, including Odysseus and Achilles, come out, kill the gate guards, and unlock the gates to let the other Greek soldiers in. The Greek army quickly invades the city, killing people, torching their homes, and slaughtering any Trojan warriors that get in their way. King Priam breaks down in tears as he watches his lovely city burn in front of him. Achilles fights his way across the city while searching for Briseis. As Andromache guides Helen, Paris, and the Trojans through the tunnel to safety, Paris decides to return to Troy to find his father and Briseis. He gives a boy named Aeneas the sword of Troy with the instructions for him to protect the remaining citizens and find them a new home, and he persuades Helen to continue the journey him, with a promise to come back for her. The Greeks manage to fight their way into the palace of King Priam, where he's fatally stabbed in the back by Agamemnon, killing him. As Briseis kneels and prays before the statue of Apollo, she is taken captive by Agamemnon. Once Achilles locates them, he races to come to her aid. Agamemnon confesses his intention to take Briseis back to Greece as his slave before she uses a hidden dagger to fatally stab him in the neck and murder him.
What Achilles tasted.
She is attacked by his guards afterwards, but Achilles arrives and saves her. Shortly, Paris arrives to avenge his brother's death by putting an arrow through Achilles' heel and then several more into his body, in spite of Briseis' cries.
No! No!
Achilles, who is dying, bids Briseis farewell and sees her escape with Paris. When the other Greek soldiers show up, the mighty Achilles finally passes away. Following this, Troy is finally conquered by the Greeks, and Achilles is given a dignified funeral, at which Odysseus personally cremates his body.